Today I am joined by Ethan Pitts. Ethan, thank you for being here.
It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, you're someone who knows quite a few different subject areas, from environmentalism to revolution, Middle Eastern studies, all different types. But given the world today and how much we care about the future of our energy and topics like this, I want to dive into your knowledge of nuclear fission and nuclear energy generally. So, really, before we get into the specifics, can you just explain what that means when someone says nuclear energy? Are they saying fission? Are they saying fusion? Are they talking about Chernobyl? What exactly is being talked about here?
Yeah. I guess before we start, we kind of can talk about where we get our energy from and kind of the historical foundation of humans, generating electricity and stuff. Um, Kind of the fundamental thing or the fundamental method how we get electricity is really through a turbine. Um, there's heat that generates steam in water. Basically, we're boiling water that creates steam that's spinning a turbine that is then generating electricity. And for the majority of the time that we've been doing that, we've been burning coal or wood or gas or something like that. Um, and the heat from the fire from burning generates that steam. And then when we start to get into nuclear energy, we're not burning a brick of uranium. The technology is nuclear fission, is what it's called, where we're taking this element, uranium, and we're splitting its atoms. And so the atoms, that's what their fission is that you're taking an atom and you're breaking it. And that in itself creates an enormous amount of heat. And then that is used to then generate steam, which then spins a turbine and generates the electricity. So that's where nuclear fission comes in. There's also the concept of nuclear fusion, which is kind of the different version of nuclear energy that we don't have in real operation right now, just because there's a lot more that goes into kind of taking atoms and fusing them together. That's all over my head. I don't know a whole lot about it. I just know that we're not quite there yet. And the majority of, I'm pretty sure that all of our nuclear energy is from fission.
Okay, and before we dive into the details and even potentially the history, depending on what your knowledge base is, how do we get all of this heat and energy from fission?
So it's really just the physics at that point that you're taking. You have like there's lots of different reactor designs and stuff, but what you're doing is you're putting these elements in a reactor, and they interact with each other. So um, you have kind of uranium cores that are in these things, um, and there's usually a kind of a moderator. So there's something like heavy water reactor. You may have heard the term heavy water or something. And the water acts as kind of an atomic mediator, which allows it kind of helps to control the reaction a little bit. But it's a nuclear reaction where there's atoms that are bouncing around and colliding with each other, and they break. And because of like at that atomic level, the breaking of the atom is the source of the heat there.
So when I hear nuclear reaction, my inclination is to be moderately fearful. I think, again, Chernobyl or even nuclear bombs. But from my understanding, this could be a potential valuable energy source like solar or wind energy or something like that. How does this play in to this energy field, renewable energy field, if that describes it accurately, or really where does nuclear fit?
So I would put nuclear energy. I wouldn't put in renewable energy because you are going in and you are mining uranium. Um, and uranium is, it's elemental. It doesn't necessarily, it'll show up in, however many million years. So there is kind of a finite um, amount of uranium there. And then, of course, there's the environmental downside of that. You have to go into a mountain and dig it out. But no, you did mention that there's, kind of this moderate fear that shows up at first, and words like Chernobyl obviously come to mind, and nuclear weapons, right? I think that those are all, valid concerns, especially given that the modern nuclear program, and really kind of the entire history of humans interacting with nuclear power, it starts with nuclear weapons programs and countries trying to develop a new kind of bomb. So I think that is definitely a valid concern that we can talk about.
So let's talk about it. How did we get from nuclear bombs to nuclear energy? Where is the bridge here? Because it seems to me like anytime we make a weapon, it doesn't just become an energy source. Someone obviously had to research this and figure out how this happened. But what was our incentive to research it? It's not every day you make a weapon and then think, oh, this could be an energy source. How did we cross that bridge, if you follow my question?
Yeah, no, I think I got you. Yeah, it's a good question. So basically we had to, we're in the process of making these weapons. And there's a lot of scientists that are involved with it. And there's a lot of people who understand that the whole goal of making the nuclear weapon, the nuclear bomb, was, well, at this point, it's the atomic bomb, because there's atomic bombs and there's hydrogen bombs. Hydrogen bombs are more powerful, but we don't have to focus on that now. But the atomic bombs, the whole point of them was to create a weapon that could release an enormous amount of energy. So right from the get-go, we have the understanding that this kind of nuclear reaction creates an incredible amount of energy. And then tragically we see that the two bombs dropped on Japan, killed hundreds of thousands of people because of the sheer amount of force and energy, and then, the side effects of radiation sickness and everything. We didn't fully understand all of this. There was a U.S. general, I think it was Curtis LeMay, who went before Congress and talked about how radiation sickness was actually a pleasant way to die. And this is back in the 40s and 50s, where we're not entirely sure everything that goes on there. We can look at that statement and just, it's tragically laughable what it is now, especially that we've seen what happens to people who are exposed to high levels of radiation. But the point is that right from the get-go, we realized that nuclear reactions generate an incredible amount of energy. And then you're coming out of World War II, and you see, there's kind of the new world order in a sense that, United States and the Soviet Union are these two big superpowers. The United States both of them have transformed into incredible industrial powerhouses in a relatively short amount of time compared to Europe and Asia, which was still developing. And there's a new push for expansion and all of this development in industry and technology and communications and, building urban sprawl in the United States and expanding. All of this needs energy somehow. And we're coming out of this new scientific experience of building an atomic weapon, and we can see that, okay, there's a lot of energy here. Now what we need to do is make sure that we can harness it. Instead of setting off a bomb somewhere, let's create a different kind of nuclear reaction and make sure that we can control it. So the kind of nuclear reaction that goes on inside of a reactor is not the same that goes on when a nuclear bomb is detonated. It's a different process. Atoms are still being split, but the idea in a nuclear reactor is it's much more controlled, and it doesn't explode like a nuclear bomb does.
And that's something I've always wondered, is how we could take something so powerful, or really more importantly, so explosive, so immediate, and contain that. Not because we have a giant chamber with huge explosions going on inside, but in fact something else is happening. What is that something else? Do you know much about What exactly is different between those reactions?
Yeah, so in the atomic bomb, there are kind of two different atomic bomb designs. There's Little Man and Fat Boy, or was it Fat Man and Little Boy? Anyways, one of the bomb design that I'm familiar with is basically imagine a cylinder that's in a bomb casing. You've got a chunk of uranium at one end and another chunk of uranium at the other end. It's programmed that at a certain altitude, you have an altimeter that measures it. At a certain altitude, an actual bomb, a charge, basically bullet fires, and it fires that piece of uranium into another one, which sparks that reaction. And then at that point, it's an uncontrolled, because there's no moderator, there's no control rods that can slow down and can control that nuclear reaction. It's just boom, that's the immediateness of it, is that there's no safeguards, there's nothing. The point of that reaction is to get as much energy and explosive force out of it as you can. Meanwhile, in a nuclear reactor, everything's very laid out. You've got, fuel rods, and you've got control rods and all sorts of things, and they're in a kind of a mediator. And when you add kind of the more fuel rods, they interact with each other, and you can get more energy just by the atoms bouncing around in the moderator. And obviously, the more that they interact, the more heat that they generate. And if you want to slow that down, you can raise fuel rods, you can lower control rods. And the whole idea there is you're just changing the amount of energy that is being absorbed by control rods and, heat generation, stuff like that. So that's kind of the difference between those two.
So, how safe really is a nuclear reactor? Because this strikes me as a situation where, look at autonomous vehicles. If you have one car accident in a self driving car, it seems by the news to be a failure, that autonomous vehicles are too dangerous. Yet, as far as I'm aware, a leading cause of death is driving our vehicles. So the standard is so much higher for autonomous vehicles than it is for normal driving. Do you think it's the case that because of these stigmas around nuclear weapons, that the standard for nuclear power plants to be accepted is similarly so much higher?
I think that there is definitely a low or a higher standard for nuclear energy. I don't think it necessarily is because of nuclear weapons. I think it's really because of the big nuclear accidents. There's been kind of around 30 high level significant nuclear accidents since the inception, around 30, two of which kind of dominate this discussion a little bit. One of them is, I guess the most recent one is the accident of Fukushima Daiichi in 2011 in Japan. And then kind of the boogeyman of the nuclear industry would be Chernobyl in 1986 in the Soviet Union. I think that those two accidents, and to a lesser extent the other ones that aren't as significant, are the ones that kind of put the stigma on the industry.
Do you think the stigma is justified?
I do not. I think that there are more factors at play that a lot of people don't tend to consider. For example, we look at Chernobyl. What happens there, you have it's like a perfect storm here. Takes place in a really tense period in the Cold War. You have the Soviet Union, which is incredibly concerned about its appearance. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union has an absolute control over the government there. And it's very concerned about its image. It's very concerned about its political legitimacy. And there's a security apparatus called the KGB, which kind of enforces that. In Chernobyl, the kind of reactor design is called an RMBK reactor. It's a uniquely Soviet designed reactor in the 1950s. It doesn't use heavy water, and it's it uses kind of a pressure tank. It uses light water, which is not as good of a mediator. And this design is approved by the center in Russia, the institute, I think it's the Churakov Institute. I probably butchered that, but anyways, it's approved by this institute, which is a powerful government body, and therefore it gets a designation of state secret. And so any discussion about the reactor is not permitted. And so it's built with the design flaws that nobody really is either aware of, or they can't really talk about it. They can't raise the issue because it's a state secret. Therefore, it's protected under espionage rules in the Soviet Union, and the KGB kind of keeps it all on lock. And so in the case of that reactor exploding, and again, the reactor itself actually exploded, but it wasn't the same kind of explosion as a nuclear reactor. You know, Chernobyl and the Ukrainian town of Pripyat, which is right next to it, they're not leveled. The actual building that the reactor was in is not destroyed. You can see it still. It was more of a pressure explosion at that point. But what happened is it's just a series of design flaws that were triggered in kind of a midnight test that they were trying to run on safety. And it was getting it down to a low power, which this RMBK reactor was not designed to operate very well at that kind of low power stage. And so it just kind of runs away from controllers' hands at that point and it explodes. And then I think the more dangerous part is kind of the government reaction at that point, because the Soviet kind of civil defense organization was pretty quick to say, hey, we need to get people out of here. We need to tell people what's going on. And we need to get them out of here. We need to evacuate these people. And then you have Communist Party officials and KGB officers who kind of, we don't need to worry about this. We need to just, go about things as normal. It's all good. And so because of that, you had a lot of people that were completely unaware. You have firefighters that show up and are walking through rubble, and they're walking past huge chunks of graphite, irradiated graphite and uranium, and they don't even know what it is because they're originally told it's just a structural fire. And so they're spraying water into an open reactor, and they're literally staring into the face of a nuclear reaction, which you're not supposed to do. And that leads to radiation sickness and all sorts of bad stuff. And so I think that the stigma really comes from these accidents that are not handled very well, particularly in the case of Chernobyl.
So you hear the stories of accidents like this, and obviously that makes you worry. And I'm sure you could pull these statistics like this from any energy source, but a nuclear reactor meltdown certainly has a punch to it that other energy sources don't have from their failures. But at the same time, based on what you've said, there is hope. And if that's the case, what is the path forward for nuclear energy? Should it be a major player in global energy, or should it remain a supplemental secondary energy source?
Yeah, I am of the school of thought that I think that it should be a major player in human energy production. I think that there's a lot of potential there, and it's demonstrated that. France, it generates most of its electricity through nuclear energy, and technology is just continuing to improve. Right? We look at instances like Chernobyl, and I think it's wrong for us to superimpose our views based on that onto where we look going forward, because that happened, 1980s, based on technology developed in the 1950s. It's old. Technology continues to develop all the time. Even the Soviet reactors were updated and drastically improved after that accident. So I think that we're on a much greater path now. And with that, there's new companies that are coming out. There's a few in the United States. One of them is called NewScale, I know, that are kind of focusing on smaller nuclear reactors. And I think that is a really interesting technology, and that I think that that's something that we should be looking at more and more for the future.
So let's play devil's advocate here. If you, quote unquote, fill a country with nuclear reactors, even with more advanced technology, as you said, decades ahead of what something like Chernobyl would have been. But they, let's say, a very small number of them start having meltdowns, even if they're smaller meltdowns. If you have more reactors, presumably the odds of having negative reactions is increasing. Even if it doesn't seem that drastic because the technologies prevent vast arrays of radiation or something like that, do you think there's potential for political recourse that could be damaging to the expanse of something like nuclear reactors?
I do. I think that a lot of the political, well, I think already the kind of nuclear industry is kind of almost stymied by the political climate as it is right now, particularly because of what's already happened in the past few decades, especially in Fukushima Daiichi. There were upwards more than 100 reactors built between the 1950s and 1996. And since 1996, there's only been one built in the United States. And yeah. And so I think that right there, you kind of see something that goes on there. That's primarily because of cost and money that goes into building these large reactors, but there's already been that. And with the more recent pushes towards renewable energy, like solar and wind, there's been a lot of effort to kind of steer the United States toward that. President Biden has his 100% clean energy drive by 2035, and that relies heavily on renewable energy. And interestingly enough, the fossil fuel industry itself has donated or invested millions of dollars into solar and wind technology. And so I think the political climate is stacked against nuclear in a way, at least in the United States, but also kind of the economic side with all these other businesses.
So even if politics was in its favor, why would one choose nuclear fission over solar energy, wind energy, or hydroelectric energy?
I would say because it has less of an environmental impact. You're still mining. It's not a zero impact energy source here, but generates an incredible amount of energy. More, if you're looking at how much land a reactor takes up, far, far, far less land per unit of energy that it's generating. You don't have solar farms that generate. There's a solar farm in California that you would need 10 times the amount of land that it takes up, and it's huge to meet the output of California's last nuclear site. So we can either kind of go. You kind of go into this apocalyptic vision of the future of all the deserts covered in solar panels and wind farms everywhere and dams dotting the countryside and kind of changing the face of the earth. Or you can have nuclear energy in smaller ones. Obviously, I don't think it's ever going to get to that point, but I think that's why we would be choosing nuclear power, just because it has less of an environmental impact.
Now, as a layperson, this might be a dumb question, but I'm curious, why don't we just put it underground?
So it's a good question. I think that really it just would have to, I think it's because it's difficult to put things underground. I'm not sure that putting it underground would really change the dynamic at all. And I guess if something were to happen underground, it wouldn't be any different if it happened up, higher. So I'm not sure that putting nuclear energy underground would really change the debate very much.
So you're saying that radiation isn't really affected in that way by topsoil or air. It works pretty much the same way if there were some kind of meltdown.
If there were, I think you would be dealing with a different set of consequences. If a reactor were to explode or melt down and explode and radiation were to leak out in a traditional reactor that's on top of the land, then you have to deal with radiated or radioactive material being blasted into the air. And you have to deal with that and kind of a cloud of radiation that goes across. But if one was to go off underground, you would have to deal with, potentially irradiation of water table and stuff like that. So, I mean, we don't test nuclear weapons underground or underwater anymore. These are, kind of Cold War treaties that ban the testing of these in the atmosphere, underground, and all these other things. But I think that it's just a different set of environmental problems at that point.
So I want to pivot slightly because in this conversation so far, we've mentioned the USSR and the Cold War several times, and I know you know a decent amount about the Cold War. So let's just shift our conversation some. I want to know your thoughts on the Cold War, as I said, and I want to hit this one question home. What changes in the world today if the Cuban Missile Crisis turns out differently?
I think it's a good question because I still think that the Soviet Union would have collapsed, and so then you kind of are stuck wondering with the question on whether or not those missiles would have stayed in Cuba. The Soviet Union was never able to kind of extend what is called a nuclear umbrella. Are you familiar with that term at all?
Somewhat, but feel free to explain it.
Yeah, so what that is, a nuclear umbrella, the United States has it, where we are basically extending our protection to a number of other countries. For example, South Korea and Japan are not nuclear powers, but they are protected with a nuclear umbrella, meaning that, that there is, that you can't attack them with nuclear weapons because we would view that as an attack as well. And the same is with kind of NATO countries in Europe and US allies around the world there. US missiles are stationed in Europe, kind of across the continent a little bit, that showed up with the Cold War to kind of put them closer to the Soviets' border. That's one of the reasons why the Soviets sought to get them into Cuba. That one came from US missiles being stationed in Turkey, which at that point did border the Soviet Union in kind of the northeast of that country. And so the Soviets felt that they needed to have nuclear weapons in Cuba. So I'm not sure if the weapons would stay in Cuba. I doubt that they really would. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet nuclear stockpile was centered in kind of four republics in the Soviet Union. So the Russian Republic, the Belarusian, and the Ukrainian, and then the Kazakh Republic all had nuclear weapons. 1991 happens, the Soviet Union collapses, and we're kind of stuck in this limbo. So now do we have four new nuclear powers, Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine? Nobody really wanted that. And so Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan all agreed to transfer their nuclear weapons to the new Russian Federation. And so now those three countries that border Russia do not have nuclear weapons. So I think that something similar would have happened with that, and with the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that the Cubans would have given up the missiles potentially.
So it's certainly fair to say that there was some economic downfall to the imperial overreach of the Soviet Union. But I do wonder, especially for people our age who are younger, they didn't live during the Red Scare, they didn't live during the Cold War. How close were we, in your mind, to some semblance of a nuclear war?
I think we were incredibly close at multiple points, not just at in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think that, and I think that a lot of people would agree, especially people who grew up there, who went to, like grandparents or people like that who grew up doing bomb drills and, helping dad build the nuclear shelter in the backyard over the summer or whatever. I think that we were incredibly close because you can't really put two nuclear armed states in a position that's that tense, where there's kind of military forces involved there. So I think that we were incredibly close. There's other close calls. A few decades later, the Soviet Union detected what they thought were missile launches, and it turned out to be just a computer glitch. But for a while, this was in the 80s, but for a good amount of time, they thought that the United States had launched a first strike against the Soviet Union and were getting ready to launch theirs before they figured out that, okay, this is a computer glitch. We don't need to worry about that. So I think that we were really close. I don't think that we are in that level of danger. And I think there's a lot that goes into that kind of nuclear deterrence theory that we can maybe talk about. But I think we're a lot better off now than we were.
I know I'm going in somewhat of a reverse order, but let's talk about where we were. What really was the cause or the major causes of this conflict? Because unless you pay attention closely in your history classes or do your own research, you're going to think, as an American at least, something to do with communism. We changed the Pledge of Allegiance to add under God to fight this quote unquote atheist communists, obviously. And that we had never changed that back, so that's an interesting remnant. But how do we... What really caused this issue? Because all I hear are these stories of the vestiges of communism. Was there more at play here? Were nuclear weapons part of that issue, or were they merely a response to other problems? What happened here?
I think the Cold War is a culmination of, and a lot of people would say that it's a culmination of maybe a century and a half of ideological development, and just greater social and economic change that happened, kind of sparking with the Industrial Revolution. You get around the mid 1800s, a guy named Karl Marx, sure you've heard of him, and a guy named Friedrich Engels, two Germans who developed, kind of an ideology of thought called Marxism. Socialism is derived in part from that as well. And basically what that, just crash course is, it's concerned about the struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie being the people who control the means of production, and then the proletariat being the worker. And the whole idea there is to bring the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning that the workers are the people who control the means of production and who control government. And this is obviously very threatening to a lot of these powers in the world at that time. Kind of the first successful socialist experiment was in the late 1800s, the Paris Commune, where Paris was taken over by a faction of Reds, who had controlled the city for a good amount of time. And it was a commune in the sense that it had abolished its military, and it was kind of grouped by people's militias, controlled by that. There was more social change, equality, stuff like that. That was the only one that Marx was alive for, and he actually seemed to approve of that one. It was then crushed by the French military. But you had this rise of socialist parties in the West that worried a lot of governments, and it was always kind of seen as a threat. I think the last elected socialist in the United States in the House was in the early 1900s, and he had what stands out most to me about him was that he had introduced a bill in the House of Representatives to abolish the United States Senate. because he had viewed it that it was undemocratic, and that it represented the will of the rich, kind of special interests groups, and he felt that it wasn't in line there. And so you have socialists who are very much vocally opposed to the system as it stands, and that's obviously worrisome. His political career didn't last very long in the federal government. Yeah, and so that's kind of where it starts a little bit there, is that this rise of socialism. In 1917, there's a kind of, well, the Russian Revolution kind of happens in two stages. The first, the monarchy is overthrown, and Tsar Nicholas II abdicates. This is part of a broader context with World War I. Russia was not performing well at all. They were getting decimated by the Germans on that front in World War I. And a lot of people were unhappy with the situation in Russia at that point. And so the Tsar abdicates and a new provisional government shows up. It's not a communist government at all at that point. And then it's led by a guy named Kerensky, not Lenin. And then it lasts under a year. And then there's a second revolution that is led by the Bolshevik Party, which is the party of Lenin, as we know it. And it topples the provisional government. The provisional government flees to the West, and the Bolsheviks establish the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and then on top of that, the Soviet Union. And so we're still talking about World War I here. The new Soviet Union is not welcomed by the Allies at all. Not welcomed by France or England or the United States. In fact, those countries actually invade the Soviet Union. That's something that we don't really hear about often in history, is that there were American troops that actually invaded the Soviet Union, and British troops and French troops. American troops landed in a city called Vladivostok, which is on the very far east. It's closer to Korea than it is to Germany. It's literally just across the border. But American troops marched down there. And British troops landed up in the north, and there was a group called the Czechoslovak Legion that kind of tore through the center of the country. And it's part of the Russian Civil War, and so you have Bolshevik forces that are fighting forces that were loyal to the Tsar, the white forces, or the white army, opposed the Red Army, and the West is helping the whites. And in this context, the Bolsheviks execute the Tsar and his family, because the Czechoslovak Legion is closing in on them. And so relations between the Soviet Union and the West don't start off very well at all. Eventually, the Soviets win that war, and the whites are expelled. There's a big white diaspora in northern China, in the United States, and in kind of the Western countries as well. That's how that happens. And then obviously you have the rise of National Socialism in Germany. It's a different kind of socialism than what we talk about now. So equating the two is incorrect. It's inappropriate. But you have Hitler rising there. National Socialism is fundamentally opposed to Soviet communism. And then that war boils over. World War II happens. We're allied with the Soviet Union right up to the end of it. And then we divide along those lines. So that's where I see the origins of the Cold War is really coming out of the immediate aftermath of World War II, with a big gradual build up to that point. So that's where I think it starts.
So how long do you predict our vitriol towards Russia or communism or anything related to the USSR, let's just say roughly, how long does that stigma last in your mind?
I don't think it will ever go away. I think that there are a lot of reasons to have kind of that, or aspects of that mindset. There's a lot of horrendous human rights abuses that happened in the Soviet Union that we should definitely address, and acknowledge that, and not shy away from that. There's instances of genocide it's kind of debated in some academic circles. It's called the Holodomor in Ukraine, that happened under Stalin's Soviet Union. Freedom of expression was limited and all sorts of stuff. So I think that kind of rhetoric will continue. I'm not sure how helpful that is in mending relations with Russia and kind of building a path forward. But I think that it will continue for a good long while if it ever goes away.
Well, I'll tell you what, Ethan. There's a lot more we can talk about, but at least as an excuse to force myself to talk to you more, because there's so much for me to learn from you. Let's call the podcast here, and then if you want to talk again in the future, I know there's much more we can chat about, whether it's revolution, as you talked about, or even another sharp pivot to Middle Eastern studies. We can dive into those as well. But I think this is a solid, digestible conversation from the nuclear world to what could have been nuclear wars.
Sure. Sounds good to me. Yeah, it's been fun talking.
Absolutely. Thank you for talking with me. Thank you for coming on. And like I said, I am absolutely looking forward to talking to you again.
I am too. We got a lot to look forward to.
Perfect. Thanks, Ethan.